Hello, I'm Peter Bell, and I'm here with Mr. Javier Orduña, Exploration Manager of Aton Resources. Hello, Javi.
Hi Peter, how are you doing today?
Wonderful. Phase one is complete at Rodruin. Time for an exploration update.
Yeah, as you know, we finished drilling in December last year, just before Christmas, and we put out the results of our program earlier this week. Now we're pretty happy with the program. 50 holes, so a little over 4,000 meters, so about an average of 80 meters of a hole. Now, some of the holes were very short. As you know, there's a lot of ancient workings very close to the surface at Rodruin. So some of the holes only got down about 5 or 10 meters, but some of them went all the way to 200 meters. So pretty much every hole hit mineralization. And yeah, we're pretty happy with what we achieved in the first program.
Congratulations. Lots to discuss. Maybe one high level question first. Section diagrams and things like that. Can we look forward to some?
Yep, for sure. They're coming. Now, as you know, because of the nature of the ground, we weren't necessarily drilling on sections everywhere. You've seen the photos, and we're drilling on some fairly rugged mountainsides, so we don't have a nice flat grid pattern to drill on. So we don't necessarily have good sections for everywhere that we've drilled. So we were spudding various holes off specific pads. But bottom line, yep, we're working our way through it, and yes, they will be coming.
All the roads that you've built are very noteworthy too. Looking forward to phase two, I see mention of a road to be built going around to the north side of the North Ridge.
Yep, yep, that's the plan. We're going to have to step back about a kilometre or so from Aladdin's Hill, and we'll take a road off down a fairly steep valley down onto the northern side, and then we'll work our way around to the backside of the North Ridge, where hopefully we'll be looking to get up some pretty steep screes as far as we possibly can to test some of the high-grade vein-like structures that we see on the north side.
Great. Any other guidance around what phase two might look like?
Yeah, well, it's going to be a combination of a number of things, a number of objectives. One, hopefully we'll be getting up onto the north side and doing some first pass testing up there on the North Ridge. Now, we think it's probably going to take at least a month and a half to get a road round to that side, so that's going to be an issue time-wise. We're very excited with the sulfide mineralization we're seeing at depth to the northeast of Aladdin's Hill, and I think that's where the big potential for Rodruin lies. We believe we've clearly hit the primary equivalent of mineralization we're seeing over a lot of the South Ridge. So we'll be chasing that out in all directions, north, south, east, and west, and at depth, of course. And basically, we'll be following up on some of the drilling we've already done on some of the other various zones and areas we've drilled so far. So there's a fair bit to do.
And hole number 50. I believe that was a vertical hole in the bottom of the valley that went quite deep and hit some fresh sulfides, as you mentioned.
Yep. It went deep. It was from the bottom of the valley, but it wasn't actually a vertical hole. It was an inclined hole, which was actually inclined, angled to the south. So it went underneath two of the shallow vertical holes, 44 and 48, which both appeared to have actually ended in unmineralized sediments. Now, we drilled under them afterwards with hole 50, and we got this big wide intersection within the sulfides with some pretty nice grades at the bottom of this wide intersection, which I think the bottom was about 11 meters at 5 grams. Now, it's a complicated area. We keep saying it's structurally complex, but it is. There's folding. We see folding in the area. We believe there's recumbent folding. There's a low angle thrusting and faulting. And then there's also various orientations of more vertically orientated faulting as well. So we're still trying to pull it all together, and we don't always see what we expect in every hole. So that deep mineralization in hole 50, we'd seen something similar in another hole number 17. So it wasn't a total surprise to see it in hole 50, but we weren't necessarily expecting it in the place where we did see it.
And hole 50, it didn't end in that whole sulfide zone.
No, it didn't end in it. It passed through the sulfide into another unmineralized section.
Is it starting to become a little more clear what the structures look like from here to there?
Yeah, well, we have a reasonably good idea of what the structures look like in that area. We have a series of fairly flat dipping thrust type structures, north dipping, one of which basically parallels the actual surface of the hillside on the north side of the South Ridge. And that in itself is a fairly major structure which basically controls and, as I say, parallels the actual surface of the hillside. Now that can make mapping a little bit difficult in places, so we know we've got these flattish north dipping faults, but we also know we've got a series of east-west trending faults which we see at Aladdin's Hill that appear to control the very high grades of mineralization, and we see them in other areas throughout the whole of the Rodruin area. So we specifically passing through the area where hole 50 is. We've also got a northeast trending structure, and you can see, if you look at some of the geological maps or the satellite imagery, you can see quite clearly there's this wedge of green sediments, which looks rather out of place, to the east of Aladdin's Hill, and that wedge in there is actually controlled by this northeast trending structure. So where we've been drilling around hole 50, we've got a combination of all these fault structures basically in the same place. And we've also got fairly significant folding of the actual sedimentary sequence itself. So to summarize, we've got all these structures basically all sitting on top of each other. We know they're there, but we're getting a reasonably good handle on what we think's happening there. But actually joining it all up at this point with what we're seeing in the drilling is still ongoing.
Always. A
Yeah,
question that you can start to answer with the drill bit too.
yeah. We'll get back out there as soon as we can and do some more drilling on either side to try and get more of a pattern, and hopefully that will illustrate more clearly what we're actually seeing.
Interesting to hear about the unit paralleling the slope of the South Ridge. I wonder if that comes to surface on the south side of the South Ridge?
No. If you actually draw a cross section running from the south to the north and looking to the west, then you actually see more than one of these flattish thrust-like structures, and they dip to the north. And this zone of flat dipping structures actually dips under the North Ridge, whereas they actually daylight around the top of the South Ridge. Now, on the south side of the South Ridge, we don't actually see any mineralization. You have the carbonates, which basically control the top of the South Ridge, and below them on the south side, you're basically into a series of, again, you see it on the imagery, dark green, unmineralized sediments, siliciclastic sediments. Now, on the north side of South Ridge, however, you've got a lot of mineralized carbonates and also mineralized sediments, but it all becomes a little bit complicated because these thrust type structures are not continuous, and they also appear to die out laterally. So rather than true individual structures, they're more like dislocations rather than continuous structures, but they're quite substantial even though they die out laterally. Now, in some places we see, such as at Aladdin's Hill, we see a series of quartz vein blows which appear to be, again, zones that actually take up some of the strain. Now, again, I don't want to keep harping back to it, but Rodruin's not straightforward. It's not like Hamama, for example, which is really relatively simple from a structural point of view.
And all this thrusting, would you use the word anticline there at all?
No, I wouldn't necessarily say they're anticlines per se. There's plenty of folding, including, we believe, recumbent folding. What we appear to have is two boundary faults about 1 kilometer apart, which run north and south of the mineralized system at Rodruin. They strike roughly west-northwest at about 300 degrees, and you can see them quite clearly on the satellite imagery. Now, these are two very strong structural features which control the topography and actually the distribution of the wadis and the valleys. And right smack in the middle of them is Rodruin. Now, we appear to have a classic sort of Riedel type shear environment where you've got a whole series of conjugate structures and folds that are controlled within these two boundary faults. So we've got a number of structures in a number of different orientations and directions, which are clearly strongly associated with mineralization that we see at Rodruin.
Wonderful. Interesting to hear that some sense of the topography locally can give you an indication of the geology there.
Yeah, it's interesting. For example, mapping on the south ridge is a little bit tricky because, as I mentioned before, literally one of these low angle thrust structures is parallel to the hillside. So as the hillside dips down at about 40 degrees, the structure is absolutely parallel and is on the surface to the hillside. Now, sometimes where we get gullies cutting down for it, you can see spectacular zones of shearing at the western end of the south ridge, and you pass into a series of effectively barren rocks within a hanging wall block of this particular structure that you see. However, what can be very hard to actually see on the ground when you're mapping is when you actually go through these structures and into a mineralized footwall block of this structure. The hillsides are covered in scree, so it's very hard sometimes to get an actual sense of where exactly we are in this set of stack structures. So it's challenging, yeah. But the main thing, I think, is we do have a good understanding of what we're seeing. But pulling it all together is not straightforward, and we certainly don't have a perfect understanding.
I wonder, with what you're saying about how things are changing laterally, what to expect between the central buttress and Aladdin's Hill.
Well, again, the geological maps that we've put out show an area as surface scree and talus to the southeast of where we've been drilling around hole 50, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. What we've actually got in this particular location is a mega breccia, which is actually a landslide type feature where basically the top of the mountain has fallen off, and you can see it's been re-cemented around blocks which can be up to the size of houses, enormous blocks. So these carbonate blocks have been re-cemented and sedimented. So we've got this zone which is essentially a paleo landslide or landslip feature, which covers about 200 meters of the hillside. Now that covers a large chunk of the northern side of the South Ridge. So question is, what's underneath it? Well, it's a bit hard to say, obviously, because we can't see through it. It could be a continuation of a surface mineralization that we're seeing just immediately to the northeast of it, but it disappears under this mega breccia unit. So we're now getting a good sense that most of the mineralization is confined to the carbonates. We do see some mineralization within the sediments, but pretty much most of the mineralization is in the carbonates.
And we've talked about those carbonates before. Any new thinking?
Yeah. Lots of new thinking. I wouldn't say we've got all the definite answers yet, of course. They look like sedimentary carbonates. We can go out and map what we think are pretty clear stromatolitic type textures. So it looks like a very shallow water environment, as we've talked about before. It certainly looks like a sedimentary rock package with mineralization mostly in the carbonates. It's got a distinct zinc assemblage, very similar, in fact, to what we see at Hamama, but the rock package is rather different. So there's a lot of broad similarities to what we're seeing at Hamama, which is interesting. But when you actually look at the nitty gritty, it's also quite considerably different to Hamama. Now, what we think we're looking at in places like Hamama, Abu Marawat and Rodruin is probably a single mineralizing style or system that occurs within the shallow water, volcano-sedimentary, low-temperature fluid environments. So what we're seeing, we believe that these different deposits are slightly different manifestations of, or if you like, a continuum of deposit types formed from a very similar hydrothermal system. So yeah, it's interesting. Now there's very few volcanic rocks at Rodruin. For example, you get out a little bit from Rodruin, the main area of mineralization, and there's some volcanics that you see, felsic pilly tuffs, for example. But actually at Rodruin, the rocks are pretty much entirely siliciclastic sediments and carbonates. So mineralization in many ways looks very similar to Hamama, although it comes with notably higher gold grades. But you don't seem to have the same sort of volcanic component, the actual mineralization. Now, we also know that a lot of mineralization is structurally controlled at Rodruin. That's obvious. Hamama, for example, though, appears to have more of a VMS sedimentary epithermal type association. So what we're tending to believe now is that it's more of a replacement style of mineralization of the sedimentary carbonates at Rodruin. And of course, as you know, we've got these high-grade zones there, which are clearly structurally controlled into structurally favourable sites, such as at Ladden's Hill. So these are the kind of ideas we're knocking around. We have plenty of ideas, but we don't have all the answers yet. So there's a lot of things we're thinking about, but it's going to take a little bit more work before we've got this thing properly nutted out.
And I wanted to ask about the zinc with this discussion of hybrid VMS.
Well, metals assemblage is very similar to what we see at Hamama in reality, and in fact also what we've seen at Abu Marwa and Waira. At all these deposits, we have a zinc, copper, lead assemblage with substantial amounts of silver and also tellurium in places. And again, we're seeing the same at Rodruin. And this is one of the things that makes us think that we're looking at a similar broad style or group of mineralization through all these deposits. But when we go to some of the other deposits, we've got some of the other targets like Sabakis and Abu Gharish, for example. Well, these are completely different beasts. But Rodruin broadly looks similar to Hamama, Abu Marwat, and Waira.
And the broader project area, there's some new information on the website describing all these different targets in detail. It remains an impressive list. Any new thinking on all that?
Yeah, it is. It is. I think it's an amazing license area. And as we've talked about in the past, we certainly have more than this one broad group or type of mineralization that we're seeing at Rodruin, Hamama, and Abu Marwat. We've now found mineralization over a very large area at Rodruin on our first pass drilling, which was the intention of the program, and we're very happy with it. But as you know, about 2 years ago, we commenced a more regional evaluation program to go and look at some of the other prospects and targets within our license area. And we have probably over a dozen and a half standalone good quality exploration targets, of which probably 5 or 6 are ready to drill now. So obviously our main focus will be on advancing Rodruin, as that's still clearly our number one prospect, but we need to do it in phases. We can't just go out there and drill 10,000 meters in one hit with a rig that drills more than 100 meters on the day shift, as it might take a week, for example, to construct a single drill pad. So we have to do it in phases. Now, plus, of course, we have, as I mentioned, a whole bunch of other targets, some of which are quite close to Rodruin within the license area. So we've got other good quality exploration targets within the license area, which we're going to go and test this year as well. We certainly hope.
Wonderful. I wondered if that area around Rodruin had other potential, or if it was really just the South Ridge and the North Ridge at this point.
Well, we need to get out and look around more in the area again. You know what the country's like. It's a pretty rugged sort of country. It's not just like going for a walk in the park. But having said that, we have walks on those hills and we've found scraps of mineralization in other areas around Rodruin, but we haven't found anything to date that looks anything like what we've actually found at the main Rodruin area. So we're now concentrating on the immediate Rodruin area, which is certainly pretty substantial in itself. And it's, to be honest, it's plenty enough to be going on with for now. But hopefully one day, when there's a mine there, you'd be looking to be doing more detailed mine-based exploration in the surrounding areas once you actually have a project up and running.
And I heard mention of the word extension to the east off from some of the drilling at the GF zone in the latest news release there.
Okay. That extension. I thought for a minute you were talking about the extension of the exploration license, which we're very happy with, and that it allows us to continue exploring as we are now for at least another year before making the next steps, whatever they are. But yeah, the extension of the GF zone. Yes, we drilled from the Central Valley. The mineralization that we're seeing at the bottom of the Central Valley essentially appears to be an extension of the carbonate Gossan-hosted mineralization, which we see at the end of South Ridge in the area that we call the GF zone.
Yeah, I wonder about going out into some of these valleys, potential for more surface sampling.
There is, yeah, we can go out and we can do some more, but I think we've covered most of what we think is at surface pretty effectively, again, in the immediate Rodruin area. We've also sampled some more gold, lead, copper, tellurium bearing veins on the North Ridge just before Christmas, in fact, which we haven't released. But the next big question for us really now is how does the South Ridge actually connect to the North Ridge? And again, that's another question for which we don't have any clear answers to just now. Now, as I say, if you imagine these northeast dipping low angle thrust structures, one of which basically parallels an outcrops on the hillside, as we talked about on the north side of the South Ridge, these effectively dip under the North Ridge. So the outcrop position roughly controls the location of the Central Valley, which of course is the valley that runs between the North Ridge and the South Ridge. But it's actually very hard to see this outcrop in the Central Valley because although the surface structures are quite substantial, it's rather peculiar. But over a distance of less than 100 meters, these structures can actually die away to nothing, and in this case, you don't actually see it outcropping on the ground. So it's challenging trying to pull all this together, but in simple terms, what we think we're looking at is a very different block of rock on the North Ridge to what forms the South Ridge. And we're seeing different types of mineralization in it. So we're seeing these quartz veins, which again are not true quartz veins. They're more sort of mineralized silica flooded structures, which are interestingly similar to mineralization that we see at the Aton Resources deposit, but which carry the exceedingly high grades that we sampled on the North Ridge. And we've also got big areas of argillic alteration on the backside of the North Ridge. Now, we assume that all these things we're seeing are all different features of a single large mineralizing system at Rodruin. But again, how it all joins up, we just don't really have the answers at this stage.
Well, after phase one, that's fair. It's a pretty exotic project.
I think so. Yeah, I'd be pretty impressed if anyone had all the answers at this point.
I think you mentioned a particular aspect that had some textbook features. Is there starting to get a sense for comparable deposit types, maybe in the Arabian-Nubian Shield or elsewhere around the world?
Well, we think Rodruin's a little bit unusual. There's nothing that we found yet that we think is a dead set lookalike. In some ways, Rodruin looks like one of these replacement manto-type carbonate-hosted deposits, as it definitely has a replacement feel to it. I certainly still believe that Hamama is on a macro scale, clearly a VMS deposit, but on a micro scale, it's not. It's epithermal, so it's a transitional or hybrid deposit, and not a clear example of either. But again, I think that all these deposits at Rodruin, Abu Marawat, and Hamama are all formed from similar mineralizing systems as part of some sort of continuum. And such is the nature of mineral deposits. Mineral deposits do not fall into separate, distinct boxes. These separate boxes in reality grade into each other. So what we're seeing are different manifestations of a certain type of mineralization system for all these deposits. But as we sort of briefly alluded to before, when we go to other places like Abu Gharam, Abu Gaharish and Bochlog, they're very different deposits. The gold mineralization, for example, at these prospects is associated with a very distinct suite of late post-orogenic alkali granites. And these targets have a completely different affinity to what we're looking at Armour and Rodruin. So, yeah, we're starting to look around the country on a regional perspective. And as I say, these things look like classic reduced intrusive related gold deposits. Now, again, within our license area, we have all these different types of mineralization, which is pretty unusual and I think pretty special.
Javier Orduña, Exploration Manager for Aton Resources. Thanks very much for talking with me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Peter. I hope we can do it again and catch up again sometime soon. Cheers.
Absolutely. Goodbye.